Hello YouTube. Today we're going to look at the Beretta 92. This gun has had more than one name. It's essentially the M9, I believe, that is the military used it and was the military sidearm for a few years after the 1911, and they're looking to swap it out now. There's a lot of debate about what they'll pick. This was one of their flashier variants of it. Sometimes it's actually a 9 and a 2, as in the number 92. Other times it's actually written out. In this case, it is the 90, as in 90, and then TWO. So there you go. I've seen various versions on that. Taurus makes a version of this, like everything Taurus licenses from Beretta. This particular one is in 40. There's only, I believe, one minor difference on the 40. What is different between the Beretta and the Taurus is how they did the safety. The safety is on the Beretta built into the slide. On the Taurus, it's built into the frame. And frankly, as you see when we get in here, this is a bear to work with. The slide is complicated as all hell. So I'll show you. It's not loaded, no magazine. It is a double single action, so it has both the double action pull, but it is also a single with a reasonable reset. The safety is also a hammer drop. So whenever you have the safety being a hammer drop, it's a little bit more complicated, but when you see how they did this, they made some really, let's call them, curious decisions in Beretta land. So anyway, let's take it apart. So we're going to lock the slide back. There's a button on the left which moves this little pin out. This pin is normally preventing this lever from rotating. Once you push it and the pin is up, now this lever can rotate. And it doesn't generally keep itself in place. If you look carefully, what it's rotating against force-wise is the recoil spring. So you'll see the recoil spring actually move around, or the recoil rod. But the key is you want to hold it in that down position and release the slide slowly. It will come flying off on its own if you don't. So now we have our slide and our frame. So I'm going to put the frame aside for a while, because it's going to take us a while to get through the slide. It is a non-captivated, no, it is a captivated, in this case, recoil rod. This is a plastic one, and looks like mine's been sitting a long time. It's got some warp in it. I haven't seen one of these warp bad enough to make it malfunction. It is an odd design. I'm not 100% sure if it's actually designed this way. Yeah, it is. You can basically stick screwdrivers in the side of this to pop the cap off, at which point this bushing would clear it and you could replace just the spring or just the recoil rod. Maybe you bought a metal one, I don't know, whatever. But either way, it's nice when these one-piece, quote-unquote, one-piece units don't have to actually be replaced as an assembly, which appears to be the case there. Now, Beretta's locking system is a little different than most. So in this position, it is locked. The slide will move with the barrel. I'm only touching the barrel, and the whole thing's moving. And if I lift up on the barrel, I'm going to lift up the whole slide. They're one piece. This little button back here pushes this this toggle piece up, which now lets the barrel move. So with that piece pushed in, that's the lock position. In order to unlock, it's going to come and something's going to push that button in, and that's going to let it slide and let it slide back. Now what you're going to see, the reason for that locking system, because this locking block is what moves, the barrel doesn't. So when it's, I'm going to leave it in the unlocked position, when it's sliding, it's not a tipping barrel. Now I can tip it at the right position, but I don't need to. Technically, similar to blowback guns, the barrel does not go up or down. As it cycles, the barrel stays perfectly still. The block toggles down. I'm not demonstrating this particularly well at all, I apologize. But the point is that the barrel will slide back and forth without changing orientation. Now, the reason for that is suppressors. One of the things that makes putting higher caliber pistols suppressors on a higher caliber pistol, meaning anything 9mm and above, is most of them have a tipping barrel design. So that's fine for normal operations. If your barrel tips down and then pops back up, it doesn't matter. The bullet will have already left, and that's the end of the story. But if I've got a can sitting out here, if I've got another 6 inches of metal that weighs a significant amount compared to the barrel, and suddenly I rotate my barrel down, I'm moving that big end all the way out here at the end of the other 6 inches of suppressor has to rotate up. So even though the back of the barrel isn't moving very far, the bigger the can, the higher up that end of the can has to go. It puts a huge amount of stress right at the end of the barrel where it's threaded, and it can cause the whole barrel or suppressor to warp. So they make a knuckle device that's designed to overcome that, but it's kind of complicated. It's a little messy and it's ugly to clean. It's functional, but essentially what that device does is allows the barrel to actually move away from the suppressor and then rotate and then re-engage with the suppressor. But it makes it more expensive. It's another piece and it's more stuff. If you could just screw a suppressor straight on, it's simpler. It's a much simpler, cheaper suppressor without a whole lot of extra, moving parts in the middle. So by preventing the barrel from tipping during operation, that's what you allow, is you allow suppressed fire. So to get this out, let's see, once the barrel's already in, if we just, there we go, we should be able to lift it out. Now, you can't lift it out if you've moved it up. There's this wide piece of the slide, this wider area, that is specifically, that's where the locking lugs can actually clear the rails and the whole thing can come out. And so now you can get a little bit better look at this mechanism. This pin goes all the way through and pushes up on a ramp that's cut onto the inside that we can't quite see. I may or may not drive that pin out so we can see the block. It's pretty hard to get the block off. By design, the block should not come all the way out. It should only come partial way out. If this pin is in correctly, it's not going to drop out. That's to keep it from getting separated while you're doing maintenance. If somebody's ever forced one out, then usually the next guy will be able to move it out too. But as a general rule, you don't. If you wanted to get it out, you would drive out that very small roll pin so that this pin could come all the way out. But essentially, this pin is just pushing in on the underside of that. It's not flat on the other side. It's a ramp, and so is the surface on the locking block itself. And normally, the rails moving there, and this block stops them. Once this is lifted up, there's a set of rails here that this can travel in so that the slide can go back. So this is what actually rides the rails, so to speak, is the locking block itself. Which means that if this is not machined right, or the slide is not machined right, locking blocks can break. I've seen in the rental guns that get hundreds of thousands of rounds through them, that they go through locking blocks pretty fast. However, the military did approve this as a gun through their torture tests. So in a normal lifespan, it's not actually any more likely to break than any other piece of any firearm. But if you take things past their normal lifespan, I do think this is essentially the weakest point in the gun. But again, if you don't hit a weak point in a gun till after 100,000 rounds, I got news for you. Your barrel's long gone at that point anyway. So that's the barrel. The rest of the slide, you might have already noticed there's a lot of stuff going on here. So there's a groove in the slide here. There's a cut in the underside of the slide all the way back on here on the, well, what would be the left if we were flipped over. There's another cut on this side, and there's a pin that we can see there. And I'll let you know what that does right here. If I put the safety on, that pin sticks out. That is, I believe, we're going to find that that is engaging on something in the frame that is actually the hammer drop mechanism. So sometimes they'll build hammer drops into the geometry of the safety itself as it goes across. They'll have a lever in here that gets pushed. In this case, I'm pretty sure it's that pin coming down and poking something. Let's actually take a look at it and see what does that poke. That pokes this guy. No, I don't know my left from my right. Sorry about that. That pokes, oh, it pokes the disconnector. So it works in tandem with the hammer drop, but it's not the actual hammer drop. So that means that one of these two guys is. So one of these is going to be, in all likelihood, a firing pin safety. So sure enough, firing pin safety. So in this case, let's see, which one is it? Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. Yeah, it's this one. This is the hammer drop, and this will be what's lifted up as the firing pin safety. So yeah, this is activating the firing pin safety. So this rearward facing rounded one, that's what's going to actually do that. Now I'm not 100% sure why they would disconnect it at the same time. Let's think that through. If the hammer were fired and I were still holding it, and so I haven't let it reset, it would have done a disconnect. So why would we... Ah, all right, let's think that one through. Let's say that round didn't go off. So we haven't had a disconnect stroke. This is not activated. So if we push down on the hammer drop, I'm sorry, no, that wouldn't work either, because no matter how we slice it, without a disconnect, we can't get the hammer cocked back. So why would we need to hold the disconnector down while we did that? Well, that's a damn mystery. Maybe we'll figure it out as we go through. So I'll put that into the pile of stuff I don't know, which you probably figured out by now is a pretty damn big list. All right, well, let's shred this thing anyway. We're in here. Let's get busy. The firing pin safety, oddly enough, comes up and out the top. So when the firing pin safety is being pushed up, that comes up. I have no idea why, if that was made visual on purpose or if they were just feeling wacky. I'm not going to pretend to really know. Let's see. From a safety perspective, if we push the firing pin safety in... If I recall, this is actually a two-stage safety. Yeah, so this that we see back here is not actually the back of the firing pin, as we can tell by the fact that when we rotate it, we didn't just bend the firing pin. It's not a crazy straw. So what it is that this is a little button that rides inside the body of the safety, and actually when you push this button, it's actually bumping into the firing pin. So that's going to be important as we go about disassembly of the whole thing. So anyway, let's start with that firing pin safety, because I think we can get at that easily enough. Let's see. I think that's going to call for one of our tinier roll pin punches. Uh-oh. You know what? I think I just figured out what I dropped. Yep. There we go. Our vice block, or our armor's block. Nuts. I have to use my very tiny and relatively bent roll pin punch here. Alright, roll pin is through, and now our firing pin safety and its spring will pop out. And once we see the firing pin, presumably this will make a lot more sense. There is a little cup on one end that held the spring, so that when you're lining it back up, that helps to keep the spring from canting. So that we got to remember to make sure that that's in place when we put it all back together. In the body of the slide is actually the big hole that the spring goes in. So it'll sit in there, and when we lower this bad boy onto it, it should line itself up pretty easily, automatically. That also helps, keep in mind your orientation if for some reason you're having a hard time figuring out, is it left, is it right? There's really only one way it can go in there, so add that to the mix. All right, so we have no firing pin safety. That's one piece out. Now, one thing to notice, this pin is the extractor pin, and if you might not be able to tell because it's like centered, but this actually is drilled through at an angle, and this is the other side of it, not centered. So obviously you got to knock it out at an angle. And to be completely honest, I can't remember whether we're supposed to come up from the bottom or down from the top, so I'm going to give some gentle taps to try and figure out which is the smart way to go. And yeah, it looks like tapping it up from the bottom is going to be the way to go. So I'm going to go ahead and tap that guy out while we're here. So we're clear, and this pin is beveled on one side, angled in, so it's much smaller. That's the top, and that'll also help you get it started when you're driving it in from the bottom. Now that that's not there, our extractor, relatively run-of-the-mill extractor. It's a little dirty, but other than that, it's relatively run-of-the-mill. Let's wipe it off while we're here. I don't do videos that show cleaning because I'm already going through all of the details, and there are several hour-long videos already. Cleaning a truly dirty gun properly takes the better part of a day, is the harsh reality. If you're going to detail it, take every piece apart and clean it and then put it back together. This is just taking it all apart and putting it back together when it's pretty much clean. Adding the actual cleaning in there, and nobody would make it through these alive. So one of the things that is notable and is that the extractor, that pin does sit pretty far in there, and if you look, that's our firing pin that we can see here, and there's a curve in it, which means that we do have to have this extractor out, I'm almost positive, or it would have held the firing pin in. So you do have to knock that extractor out. I will do a test on that to see if I'm lying or not, but I'm pretty sure I'm not. So try and keep my parts together there. Oh man, that is much dirtier than I realized. Underneath extractor claws is a dirty place in a firearm. And it's an important place to keep clean, because any funk that's in there is preventing the extractor from coming all the way forward or all the way, in to the breech face, which means the more goop that's built up there, the less strong your extraction is, and the less likely it is to keep working. All right, so we're getting close to the fun parts. And fun is a relative term. What you can see is there's a roll pin there that's gotta do something, and there's a pin here that when it's forward, that pin, we can't see it anymore. When it's down, we can. So something in the way that detent system is, that's probably a pin and a spring and a detent that's given us the snap into each position. But again, not something we can drive out. And yeah, this is the one. This is the roll pin that's going to let us take it apart. And we can tell that because in this position with the safety on, we can get to it. With the safety off, it's back here where you can't get to it. So obviously that's not a part of taking it apart. There's a little left-right wiggle room. So while at first it looked like you couldn't get to that pin, in fact, if we nudge it over to one side, you'll see that we can. And on the underside, what you see is the real money shot. There's a groove cut in the slide to get to that pin, which tells us that it goes in and out right there. So that's what we're going to do, is we're going to set our roll pin on that bad boy. And our roll pin punch, rather. And gently start tapping, and sure enough, there's our roll pin rising up. Now we kind of got to remember things like this. Like, this will be the last piece we put back in, and it'll be a pain in the butt to do it. We're going to have to line up an awful lot of crap. So now that that's off, things are going to start moving and grooving. And one of the biggest things is this pin system. We're going to get to a lot of things that are a pain in the ass, basically. Essentially, once I start to move this out, nothing is going to be, pushing in on that pin. Right now, as I rotate the safety, I'm pushing down on something, which is pushing that pin out. Once I start to remove the safety, that mechanism is going to come out, which means getting the safety back in will involve somehow holding that piece down. Now, the other thing you can note is that this side of the safety, now that it's disconnected, the roll pin's not there, the safety's staying on, this side is free to turn. So that will probably be relevant in two ways. One is, I'm guessing that we can actually remove this if we keep rotating it. Maybe. Yes, if we put it in the right position, we're going to be able to start rotating this now, or start removing this. Now, once I get it to a certain depth, my guess is I'm going to hear a pop, and that's going to disappear. So that is what we can now see. So that this big pin is, I'm not going to do that with a roll pin punch. This is the business end of this little guy. So when I push that pin in, the little guy comes out. And if we look in here, it rides in this cutout of the slide. So the only place where we could actually get this out was when we rotated it all the way down to the point where it wasn't going to be in that groove anymore. We will have pushed it all the way down, and then we slid it out, which means getting it back in is going to suck. And I would say that there's probably a trick to it. Except I will also tell you, I don't know what it is. Maybe we'll try and rediscover it. What I have done in the past is actually push this pin out for all I'm worth, and get it going, out the far side of the gun, and then grab that with a pair of pliers and hold on for dear life as I slide this back on. So we'll see if we really have to do that or not. But we're at the point where we can start trying to walk the safety out. And this is where things get weird. Because of that button. We've got to get this safety in exactly the right position and rotate it in exactly the right way. And the first thing that you'll see is that the button can't clear left or right. So the button, even if we push the button in, now we can rotate the safety, but not enough. That button is still going to cause us problems in all but this position. So in this position we can move it a little bit more, but it ain't enough. And the other thing that I'm looking for is that this, I know, is a detent. Now I can actually see the detent. I want to make sure that I don't lose track of that. At some point I will have worked this far enough out that that's going to pop out. So what I'm talking about here is essentially the fact that we've got springs galore. I will remember the correct position for removing this eventually. Oh, Stimpy, what is it? Essentially, there is a position, and it's not going to be with the safety down because it can't come any further left. The safety can't rotate any further without us getting it a certain amount of the way back. So our puzzle here is simply what is preventing us from getting that safety moving all the way across. It moves that far. And then something is hanging up on it. And it looks like... Is it our button can't go down anymore? No, our button... It's not our button that's not clearing. Door. Ah, fat fingers. Having a vague memory that that might be what it is, that we actually have to get... We have to grab the firing pin and manipulate it further forward. So we have to have the button pushed in. And also the firing pin. Is that as far forward as it goes? Nerds. So obviously I'm forgetting something. Well, actually we're far enough out at this point that I could rotate down. So maybe that's what I'm supposed to be doing. Ah, alright, so we had to start it going to the left just enough to get past this little wing of the safety. So we had pushed it off, you know, a little bit, and then we could rotate it to this past, too far up position. Our detent is just shy of clearing, but I believe now we're in a place where we can actually rotate it a little more. I'm trying to keep my finger over that so we don't lose it. Oh, and there it goes. Alright, so that was that detent that I was terrified of losing. I got lucky and I hung on to it. And now, oh, another one fell out. Shit's falling out everywhere. Alright, that's what we kind of expected. So this was the one that's going to activate the detent on this side that we discussed earlier. Rides in this piece of the safety. So to get this one out, we cammed the safety over, so slide the safety out. Otherwise it's stuck in there. As soon as it cleared the other leg, it comes popping out. Now getting it back in means we've got to get it in, push down, past the safety and all that. But either way, it's the smaller of the two, if you put them side by side. And its spring just literally... oh no, there it is. Whew. Thought it was just teleported into the ether for a second there. Alright, so our two detents, and basically what I'm doing now is working my safety out, and the button has to clear, and that's really the next interesting bit. Is there's only going to be one place in the entire body of this thing as I rotate it, and there it is. So right now we've got the safety too far up, which let us get it to this position this far out, and now we're going to rotate it the other way. So the big side of the button, the little side of the button is what the hammer hits, the big side is what the firing pin hits, but it's held in here by gravity. So there ain't nothing in there. Once it's exposed, the pin can come out. So putting it back together, you just drop it in there, and the frame's going to push it into place, and it's going to do its job, but there's no cross pin, there's no nothing. But it's also what was preventing us from getting the safety any further out. So now that the button's out, I got to put a finger back here to catch the firing pin, but the rest of our safety can come out. And as mentioned, the firing pin and its spring also can come out. That looks like another opportunity to clean something. Yep. So we're going to go back in and talk about all these crazy cuts in the firing pin and how they work. But let's take 1 minute and just marvel at this crazy ass safety. So this detent was going in on this end, and that was really what made the safety snap up and down as the detent moved from this position to this position. So it could click in here and then just stretch out in here. So it compresses and pops here. Little strange mechanism, but it's designed to give a difference in feel between the up and the down positions, as opposed to just making them both solid. The button, I'm going to set this aside for now. The button sat in there like that, and so the firing pin would normally back right up to it, and the hammer would hit the little end of the button, and that would push the firing pin forward and make the gun go bang. But this is too wide. The button, the whole button is wider than the rest of the safety, meaning the hole that has to come out isn't really big enough while the button's in there. So they made it so the button would actually fall out in a position that the safety can't normally get into. So when the safety's in the gun, it can never be manipulated to the point where the big side is facing down. It's either going to be in the safe position where it's canted but still retained, or in the not so safe position where it actually does its job. But the only place where it can fall out of the frame is that one opening that's off of the one side. So that's pretty darn nifty. There's other surfaces in the safety itself which operate as we saw the hammer drop, and that's this big surface here. When the safety is when it's in the fire position, this is flat and this does not poke down and touch anything. When you put the safety on, this surface cams over, and it cams over this piece right here, pushing it down, which is your hammer drop. So that is the crazy safety. So when it's back in here, again, I can't pull it straight out the side. When it's in its topmost position, it can't come up past 90 degrees because it has this little ledge. So to get this thing out, effectively what we did is we pushed it a little bit, we rotated it up, that let us push it a little bit more, get the detents out, which let us rotate it even further, which let the large button drop out, which then let us get it the rest of the way out of the gun. So it's a multi-step, rotate in multi-direction process. But I don't know of any way to do it wrong. It's very hard to remember the exact way to do it right. Let's look at that crazy firing pin safety. And it's not going to be rocket science as to how this one works, I don't think. So the safety rides in there like this. And let's see, where does it engage? Yeah. So this angle cut in the firing pin matches this angle here on the safety. So they will mate up when the firing pin is actually going all the way forward. When the safety is down, then it's here, and the firing pin is going to bounce against it. And so when something lifts the firing pin up, now it can come the rest of the way. So it stops basically on both of those surfaces at the same time. So it bottoms out both here and here. I think technically it's going to bottom out more on this ledge, but either way, two different chunks of the firing pin being connected, and the idea is that when it's up, it's this piece here that keeps it from going forward for real. So once it gets far enough down, now it's got room. And that's the firing pin safety. The big hole, if you recall, it's a little tiny roll pin that's going through the big hole, and that's so that it actually has room to go up and down. So that is our firing pin safety. And oh, this other cut is the part that you can see when you look in to where the extractor sits. So if you can get enough light to see what's going on in there, I hope, not sure, that curved surface is going to mate up with the extractor, I am pretty sure. So if the extractor is in there, and I'm right, firing pin is retained by the extractor. So it can still move left and right because the curve in the firing pin is fairly large, but this is protruding just enough to hold that firing pin in. So, you know, knowing all those different things that hold it and at what position they hold it kind of should be able to give you a good plan for a preferred order of putting it together or taking it apart. The other thing you'll notice is that curve cut is a different angle than the flat cut. And again, it's because the extractor sits in the gun at an angle. So the extractor itself looks like it's curved upside down from normal extractors. It's got a curve on the bottom the bottom comes in further than the top. But in reality, it's actually grabbing on to the round, fairly far off up here. So it's grabbing here instead of a side extractor. It's up here at an angle, which means that those are actually far more lined up with the side of a round as it comes up. And that's also, why it's off at an angle here is because while this will be off at an angle, let's see, I'm holding it upside down so that's not showing what I'm trying to show. Because this is at an angle, this part will be a 90-degree up and down. So this part is moving, smoothly against, the firing pin safety, vertical, perfect cut. And this area at the front, when this back one is held, vertical, this is off at an angle. So it's coming up like this. It matches the path that the roll pin and the safety itself are going to ride in there. So, firing pin, extractor, we have the safety and its button and its two detents, and it's one tiny ass roll pin. So scooch all of that to one side. That's it. We finally have the whole damn thing apart for the slide. I really need to clean this. I'm sorry. I've got cat hair all over it, which doesn't really hurt it, but it is obnoxious. All right, so let's think about what might make more sense putting it back together. If we put the firing pin in first and then put the extractor in, the extractor would hold the firing pin in, and we probably wouldn't have to manipulate it as much when we go to put the safety in. So let's try that logic. It also is an easier thing to figure out, how to line up, because it has that substantial curve on it. Whoops. Ow. There's the big punch. Oh, I have fumble fingers today. So if I'm correct, let's stick my extractor spring in here. Of course, it doesn't want to line up with its hole. There is a recessed hole that this sits in, so and it's also at an angle. That's the trick. It actually was lined up. It's also at an angle. When I push this in there, if my firing pin is far enough in, yes, the whole thing is held together, and now I just got to get the pin in for this. Now, we said that this pin had a beveled end that's going to go in. You know, in some worlds, you would do that from the top, but I think in this case, that we want to come in from the bottom to pull that off. Maybe. You know what? I don't think we're going to be able to angle that in because it's going to collide with the frame. So, yeah, we're just going to get this going and tappa, tappa, tappa. And I've caught the extractor itself. So, that's enough to get us going. And now... want to come too far out the bottom because we don't like it when things intrude into the path of the slide. So I'm going to flip this around and just tap it so it's just flush. And that leaves it just about perfect on the other side too. It's a good sign. Alright, so now I don't have to worry about two different things I don't have to worry about. One is the firing pin's not going to pop out. And the extractor's already in. Now, I can tell that the firing pin does protrude just a little bit of the way into that safety path, so we are going to run into it at some point. I guess arguably we could put the firing pin safety in now. I'm going to save that one for later, though. We're going to get into the fun bits here. Now, there's a lot, and we got to make sure we get all of it, and there's only going to be one right order for it all. And it's just going to be tricky. So the first thing that we're going to do, though, is to just get it started a little bit, which is to say we're gonna push the firing pin back just enough to get it past it, and now we're at this position and we're gonna drop the button back in. Okay, and now once we rotate it, we're now up far enough on the top that we can get the big detent in without the cat hair. So now we'll get that in. That one's going to be just a little trickier. To line up. Like, I'm not 100% sure how we're going to do that. And now the other fun part is we can't push this too much further over without blocking access to this hole where the other little tiny detent goes. So it's kind of like you have to do both of these at almost the exact same time. I'm going to try just getting this one first. I say try because I don't have a whole lot of hope that it's going to work. So I think... I'm not sure what the right angle for the dangle is here. Whoop! Fail. So I'm going to get that detent pushed. Shit. Oh, dear Lord. Well, if you saw the end of the part 1 video, You would have seen me launch this detent at great force in a random direction. 20 minutes of crawling on my hands and knees later, I recovered it from underneath a random AK where it had landed. So we're going to pick right up in our no fear kind of mode. And this time we're going to do the intelligent thing, which is to keep a hand where we're going to catch that detent should it go walkabout a second time. Like that. That son of a bitch just hates me. Excuse my Yiddish, but oh my goodness. This guy just doesn't want to play nice. So, we're trying this from every which angle we can think of. Alright. So, now we've got it in, but the challenge is that we've blocked the passage for the other piece. And in order to get them both in at once, I think we're going to have to start the one same damn time and hold it down with our thumb. So I'm putting the smaller detent in, holding it with my thumb, getting this detent in, and there. I've got this one in and this one in essentially at the same time. Now, the other thing I had to do before I push this all the way in is lower it to the point where it can get over that. So if I push that in too soon, I wouldn't have, that ledge would have been in my way. So now our system is half back together. So the tricky bit is now, how do we get this guy back on? Since we know you know what? I think I just thought of a smarter way to do this. I did. All right. So I'm going to release that detent again, as frustrating as it was the first time. Catch it this time. And I'm going to be clever, I think. I'm going to be clever. I'm betting that if I put this in place first, that I can use this piece to just push down the detent. Seriously? Did I just launch another one? Alright. So, my plan is that if I can get this guy out of the way, I'm just going to take whole safety out for a second. My logic is that if I can get this piece to just be sitting in there, it will hold it'll hold that guy down. And I think, let me do some measurement first. I think part of my problem might be, I was thinking I could lower this down and use it to push that piece in, but no, the way that hole is cut, this guy really has to go right over that. But the idea is that once this left side, or excuse me, right side is in place, this will hold in that ridge and keep the left side from moving, and then we'll just push the other right side. It should allow us to grab the thing and just get the one side on first in a way that it can't then move around. So right now I'm trying to get my thumb under it, push it up as far as I can. I think I'm going to switch to a punch for this. Now again, if I slip off, then I'm going to be crawling around again. And this is where a few extra arms would probably help. Oh, that would have been a clever idea. If I can get the punch to hold him in. Oh, almost had it. Doesn't really matter what angle this guy's going to go in at. He just has to go in. If I were using a larger punch, I could probably do this easier. Ha! Ha! So, now that he's in there, that pin and spring is going to hold him in there so that we don't have to manipulate two things at the same time. So now we're smarter. We're using our brain instead of our much smaller brawn to solve our problem. So once again, this button goes in while we're down, and then we're going to rotate it around to the up position. And this time I only have to worry about getting this guy in place, because the other side is just gonna stay there for me. Just gonna make sure that this is far enough out. Well, if nothing else, we've gotten a delightful lesson in patience today. So, look at that. Beautiful. That's just sexy. So our safety is in there. This side is free spinning, and we will now line it up for the roll pin, which is going to be in the safe position on the side that's actually got a detent moving, and on this side it's just going to be so the hole is at the top. We're going to grab our roll pin and start it by hand. Take our roll pin punch. See if we can't get that moving. Pretty sure he's lined up. And a few taps on the hammer. I need to go just the tiniest bit further on this roll pin. And I'm just checking the bottom. If I push it too far, then it'll bind on the inside. So I gotta make sure I didn't go too far, and I didn't. So now it's not scraping on the top, it's not binding on the inside, which means the only thing left for us to do on our slide is the firing pin safety. And as we discussed, there's a hole for the spring. And then there's the corresponding divot on the underside of the safety. Help you keep in mind which way it goes. Really, it should only go in one way. And once we hold that in, we should have a clear path to drive the roll pin through. And this looks pretty symmetrical. I don't think there's a real left or right to it. So, just gonna give a couple taps to get him started. That's far enough to actually hold that in. Take a roll pin punch. And seat him flush. So we have our firing pin safety. You can see it moving up there. We have extractor under pressure. We have the safety working. I'm gonna just give it a manual test here. If I try and push it forward, it only moves a little bit and it's blocked, and the firing pin should not in turn protrude. So it tells us the firing pin safety is blocking it. And now I'm going to stick my big fat mitt in here and push the firing pin safety, and now the button can be pushed a little bit further to the point where we should see it protrude. Whoops. Out the firing pin hole. Look at that. It's beautiful. Alright, so all our bits are working on the slide. As we discussed with our... I'm going to leave this apart for a little while longer before we put that together. So for now, let's stop there and leave that in the field strip position and set those guys aside. And let's turn our attention to the frame. There's a trick to getting the grip off, and it has to do with if you notice that there's one side of the grip here that's wider, that's got a space, and the other side doesn't, and there's a pin there, and there's a little hole here and a little hole here that you can use to manipulate that pin, which means that we can probably push it over to the other side, or vice versa, maybe. I don't remember. Let's see. Let's take the hammer tension off. That'll make our lives a little easier. Yes. So now we can actually push in on this little. It's actually a lariat hole, and take some of the pressure off. And I believe that with some of the pressure off, yes, that pin now popped through. And I believe that the popped through position is the position that's going to let us slide the grip nearly all the way off. You have to spread the plastic just a little bit at the end, and the grip comes off. Plenty of cat hair on the inside. So, a review of what I just did. That pin is actually a retaining pin for the entire plastic grip. So they've wallered out a little piece on one side, but not the other. And that pin, which normally can sit, which can sit completely flush within the frame, can also be manipulated after you put the plastic grip back on. You push it off just a little bit to one side, and now the grip couldn't come off. So that's the locked, locking the grip position. Centered is unlocked. Now if we just push on that, this pin will drop out. And if we look, there's actually a right and a wrong way to have done that. And we'll have to study that. There's a groove on one side so that it will be able to push out in one direction, but maybe not the other. Let's see how that actually works in conjunction here. Yes, this plastic body has a flat side on one end and a rounded side on the other, so that when the spring pressure, sorry if that was off camera, when the spring pressure is there, so just like this has a flat side and a ramped side, one side of the plastic is ramped and the other is just a flat cut. So that flat cut prevents it from being pushed too far over, but it also makes it so that if it's perfectly centered, it's going to want to push itself over to hold on to the frame. So when we go to push this in, we just got to remember to do it, at the right side, and it should automatically pretty much center itself, off center itself, I should say. I can actually do that once just to manipulate it now. And what I'm going to do here is just guide that so it's already centered on the plastic. And yeah, so if I'm correct, the way this pin is going to go in is going to match like this, so that when we have it in there, its natural position with very little force should be to pop into that position. And if we push really hard on this side, the ramp will help guide it into the unlocked position. But realistically, the idea is that once we slide that back on, we'll have to use just very little force on this side of it, and it will simply pop into the correct locked orientation. So anyway, to relieve the main spring pressure, we just push that in. It should fall out. The housing falls out. The main spring comes out. I don't know what that's for. So let's take a look at how this guy works. The back of the trigger bar here is clearly also the disconnector, as it is in the path of the rails. So after we've pulled the trigger and it's fired, it's going to cycle the gun, and in order to get the sear active again, see right now the sear's been disengaged, this will get pushed down as the slide cycles, and what you'll hear and see is the sear snapping back into position, and now the hammer can't go forward. So when we're doing our trigger pull, this piece here is actually the firing pin safety, so it's gonna it will move that. So right now the spring of the firing pin safety is pushing it here. So the first thing that we see the trigger bar encounter is that firing pin safety, and the hammer is being cammed back as well until we hit the release point of the sear. So somewhere inside where we can't see, the underside of this trigger bar is moving the sear off of the hammer and letting it drop. Now in double action, it's the same concept. Somewhere under the sear, under the trigger bar, is grabbing the hammer and actually doing the entire cocking of it, as well as getting it to the point of release. So we'll see how all that works when we get in there. Now this spring here that rides in the frame and in the underside of the trigger bar, that's not the trigger return spring, but it is the counter force for the disconnect. The trigger spring is up in here. So I'm thinking that we can probably get that out. So I'm gonna pop that spring off, and I'm gonna actually pop it to the inside and just manipulate it out. So this leg actually sticks into a hole in the frame here, and then the bottom part can be rotated down, rotated down into the frame. So into the hole in the frame, these pieces rotate into the frame itself, and then this leg just pops into the underside groove of the trigger bar, and that's how that whole thing works. So again, we can pop it off from the inside, from the outside. I think it's a little easier on the inside, and get that spring out. And now I think that we should, let's see. So it looks like the trigger bar is coming through the top of the trigger here, and if we look, that's also where our trigger spring is hung on. So in order for us to remove the trigger bar, probably gonna have to relieve a little bit of that pressure off of that spring leg, and then the trigger bar comes out. Because yeah, there's a groove in the center of the trigger bar just to catch that leg of the spring. So whoops, let me put the trigger bar in properly. We will have to bring that leg forward and then let it rest in its groove. Alright, so anyway, since we're doing disassembly, we're just going to bring that spring forward so the tension is off, get a fingernail under the trigger bar, and slide it. Now, as soon as we're clear, that spring flops all the way to the back there, which means we're probably going to need to do some manipulation of that. And the way that we're going to do that is by just pressing the trigger to bring the trigger forward, so that carries the spring with it. Then we're going to grab it with our pliers here, and then we can manually move the trigger bar back. And that way, the trigger back. So we're holding that spring, we put the trigger bar back in, and then let it rest on it again. But for now, it's okay to flop around. And so that's our trigger bar, and we can look at the various surfaces back here. Not sure. It looks like there might just be the one sear surface that both does cocking and releasing. We'll have to check. That'll be interesting once we get a little closer to the hammer. It looks like the spring for the slide lock, it looks like it's protruding over the trigger pin, which means if we wanted to take that trigger pin out, we're going to have to get this off first. So I rotate it up and gently bring it out to the side, and I can see that there is a spring wound around the bar, the rotational pin of the slide stop, and leaning in this little groove of the slide stop there, and then dipping in through that hole in the frame. So as we pull this further and further to the side, we're starting to bend that spring out of whack a little bit. So before we bend it too far, I'm just going to see if I can't lift it up and over. Just try and, well, let's try it from the underside. Yeah. So that releases our pressure, and now you can see how this thing was doing its job. So the spring leg sits in that little groove to keep pushing downward pressure, and the other part of the spring sits in this little hole right there. So the whole thing sits in there like that. So that's our slide lock. Let's see, if we, now that the slide's out of the way, we can actually rotate this bar. So normally it can't rotate past this position because the slide would block it. And there's a cutout here where this pin has a recess that catches it, so that holds it from accidentally being taken down until you extend that pin. But now that we've got it out of the way, we can lift that up, at which point now our pin is free to move a little bit further out. It's not going to come all the way out yet, but there we go. That's the takedown lever, and you know, I'm not bloody sure why that didn't pop out. Oh, you know what? It would have just popped out the first time. It was actually hung up on itself. That was so. As soon as I'll try and illustrate that a little bit better. Technically, as soon as we clear that, the pin should be able to... Oh, I lied again. There is something retaining it. What the hell? Oh. When I turn this? No. But when I start to take it out, I hit a certain point. Well, that's a puzzle. I am not 100% sure what that actually hangs up on. Oh, you know what it could be? That blue piece. This blue piece is actually... it's a removable piece. If I tap it just right, it should come out. Oh, you know what? It's binding on the spring. Just not my day. Alright, once we get the spring out, yes, now our blue piece comes out. So this blue piece is a it's a 40 thing. The 9 doesn't need it, so when they moved things around for the 40, they ended up creating this little buffering piece, and they kind of gave it some dual duty here. The spring goes underneath it, and therefore the pin goes underneath it. And what it is they that pin rides in that groove, and so until something lets pressure off of this, and basically the takedown pin is holding the blue piece down against this, so it really can't move past right here until something lets this up a little bit, and then it can clear. So there's a drilled groove with an end, and this has just enough size-wise that it holds it perfectly in place. Once this pin is out of the way, this can kind of flop up and down just a little bit, which is just enough to get everything past it. So now this does have a flat side as well, which means there might be one other way to do that. I'm not 100% positive on this, but we're going to give it a try, which is if the pin is in here holding all those things down, it's possible that, yeah, so it's a rotation thing. So when this is in its normal position where it can engage that, if the takedown lever is out of the way, it's going to be retained because the round side is engaging in the blue piece. If we rotate it just a little bit to the point where the flat side is going to come up against it, it can clear that piece. So there's a flat on that cylinder, and so when the flat is at the top, that lets it come past the blue piece. Or alternatively, take it apart, get the spring out, get the blue piece out, and you've got it all. So that's your takedown lever. While we're here, I want to show you how the barrel works in this one. So the outside rails are, engaging in the slide. And what's going on here is you've got these inner rails here and here. That actually follows these grooves on the inside. So if I hold the locking block out of the way, what we can see is... Oh, actually, I'm sorry. I have to actually start that in the middle for this to actually work correctly. But what you'll see is that is how the barrel goes in. And so this is a better illustration of the barrel can go back and forth, but it doesn't go up and down. And the pin that we're talking about that causes the locking block to move is going to be pushed in by the frame as the technically the barrel is what's staying still, and the frame is what's coming back forward. And so that's now aligned with the slide. And so now the slide can come back, and when the slide comes forward, it's going to pick up the barrel at the very end. And when it does that, it causes the locking lugs to lift. So there's a ramp in here that those ride along. And actually, I think the ramp is underneath. Yeah, I'm sorry. So it's the ramp is down here, and the lug surface that it rides up is there. These are too fragile to have been that. So the idea is, let's see if we can logic our way around all this. This is the normal locked up position, and the gun fires, so the barrel's going to come back. That pin bottoms out in the frame, and so this is holding the slide and the frame together. So the barrel and slide are both coming back, but as that button gets pushed, that forces this locking block down until it's aligned with the rail. These are your rail segments. So now the slide can continue moving without dragging the barrel with it. And again, when it closes, it just picks up the barrel here, and that locking block rides that ramp up into the locked position. So it comes back here, which allows the round to feed up and all that. So slide is coming forward, pushes around up, chambers the round. As the hood here crosses that top of the barrel, it begins to move the barrel forward into the locked position. Fire the gun, the barrel and slide move together until the cuts are out of the way, and then the slide continues back, comes back forward. Again, the hood bumps into it, that lifts up and locks them together. So on the slide part, this raised area here is what that lug is lifting up into. And so when that lug is up, when the barrel is forward, that's how it's connected to the slide. So when the barrel wants to move backwards, it's going to take the slide with it until those wings get pulled down where they can ride in the runners. So that's the locking mechanism there. Set that back aside. And I'm trying to remember the details of some. This does have a reversible magazine catch, and there is a trick to it. I'm trying to remember what it is. To reversing it, that is. Ah, yes, that would be what it is. So, the magazine catch, when it's normally in place, let me get it back in first and show it working, and then I will demonstrate what I just meant to screw up there. So essentially, these two little mechanisms that have a spring between them, and they move on the inside. Both of these engage in the cutout in the frame. So if you can see this area here, how there's the whole area for the magazine, but then there's this deep recess. That's where those little metal bits fit. So when you're popping the slide or the magazine release in or out, what you have to do is make sure that it catches in those lugs where you need it to. Urgh. It's been so long since I've done this that I am absolutely not sure of the exact correct way to do it anymore. How embarrassing. Been one of those days, embarrassment-wise. There we go. So, normally, this is the magazine release position. And when I push this, I'm moving the whole piece. And this arm, this side of it here, has the catch that actually engages in the magazine. However, I can push in on this side because of the way those springs are built. And if I push it in far enough, it pops right out, which means I can reverse it effectively the same way. Whoops. I'm trying to show you reversing it and I'm failing. So to reverse it, we get it started in the other side, and once it's hooked into that ridge, we can push that side in. And now we've got the same thing happening in reverse. We've made it a left-handed one. So it just pushes in like on the other side, and the whole thing just pops around like that. For some reason, this is a lot easier in my head than when I actually go to do it. Never remember which side goes in first. TGIF, toes go in first. That was almost it. It's been one of those days. Alright, so to release, you push it on the opposite side and it's going to pop up. To push it back in, you basically do it from the inside and you just thump it over and you push the working side goes in first, and then you just thumb in from the inside the other one and it'll pop into place. I'm a little worried that if I drive this one out, it's going to be a pain in the butt to get it back in, because you have to have that spring under force to go back in, which means you need either a slave pin to hold it in there, or something that can push down pretty darn evenly. I suspect I have a close enough slave pin, but realistically, do you guys really need to see that? It's not rocket science there. This pin, it can only go in one way, and it's retained by that little spring that was holding this in. So I'm not going to take that out right now just because it's such a pain in the butt. And we've got a few more pain in the butt pieces to go once we get into that sear system down there. So I think we're ready to take this pin out. Now this pin only goes in one direction. It's wide on this side, it's narrow on this side, and it goes through the firing pin safety, the hammer drop. There's a bushing of some sort that I don't remember if it's actually functional. I think it's attached to that. It's holding one of the two pins holding the ejector in, and then the other side of the frame. So I'm just going to push that all the way out, and it has the head on one side so that it can't drift out the other side of the gun. And now I'm just going to hold these because this one has to come out like that, firing pin safety. The hammer drop and its attached little bushing. Don't know that it actually rotates. I think it's just riveted in there. So obviously the bushing is going to push something forward when it gets pushed down. My guess is it's a sear drop. So now we can start to see the sear, which is this guy here. So when the hammer is cocked, this piece is holding it. When this piece moves forward, then the hammer can fall. So the hammer itself is on this is a pin, and again it's a giant on one side, but it just goes straight through. And the hammer, the only tension the hammer is under is from the sear pushing back on it. So that's our hammer. And what we can look at right now is partially, anyway, some of how it works. So in double action, when the hammer is basically up, the trigger is going to be pulling it like that. And so that's the whole thing. And then what's going to happen when it gets far enough forward, that's a pretty big hook that it goes into there. And what happens is as it gets far enough back, it's going to cam itself off of that. And so at the beginning it's a big hook that's holding into, but at the end you've got a fairly crisp sear surface on the very back of those as they drop off the very top of this. So that's your double action pull, as it brings it all the way back, and then it's free to drop off the very bottom. In single action, with the hammer cocked, this is going to probably just be interacting with the sear, which would be holding it here. There is a half cock notch up here, and then there's where the sear itself is going to hold it. So well, let's see what else is in there. Our hammer strut. So hammer strut. In this case, this hole, this smaller hole that's been milled out there, is actually to provide a rounded surface where the hammer strut will actually push. So that's kind of a clever way to accomplish that. Nothing goes through that hole. The idea was to just provide that rounded cavity where the end of the hammer strut can go, so that it has some ability to smoothly rotate. So that's your hammer strut. And so now what's left is the sear and its spring, and not hard to get out, but kind of a pain in the butt to line back up. But it's really not possible to see what's going on while it's in there, so we're going to go ahead and pull the pin and just dump it out. And so what's going on when that pin is in place is that this spring is going over it like this, or technically like this, and is under pressure when you put it together, so it's pushing the sear towards the back of the gun. So what you really couldn't see while it was all in there was that's its angle that the whole thing is at. And so when we put this together, that's really the hard part, is that this spring is under tension when the pin goes through it. But that's not as important as studying where is the sear actually going to engage our hammer. Now, unfortunately, because our big old knobbly hammer pin will cover all of the surfaces that I would like to show you, I just kind of have to hold it in place. So there's it sitting in the big hairy half-cock notch, and that there would be the actual regular sear surface. So it's the top of the sear there, where you can see it's polished, and it's the underside of this ledge right there at my thumbnail. That's the actual single action surface. The sear gets pulled away, the hammer can rotate. So all these other things on the sear, all the other shapes and whatnot, their function is how it interacts with other pieces. So this leg over here was, just for the spring, so that's no big deal. But this tall part on top, if you recall, there had to be something which activated the sear in order for the hammer drop. And so that's actually this piece sitting there. So these sit like that, and when the the safety rotates and pushes down on this, that's going to push back on the sear. So that basically does that to bring the sear out of engagement with the hammer. So that top piece is to engage the hammer drop. And somewhere, we flip it over, try and hold this in place. Not sure how well it's going to work. The idea here is to see how the trigger bar engages the sear in single action mode. So we saw in double action, it was grabbing the hammer. In single action, it's going to come in, go in that. Trigger bar sits on the outside of the gun, so this is as deep as it goes. I'm actually going to lay the trigger bar in place partially to get a sense of it. So we can see that the only part of the trigger bar that actually makes it all the way into the body of the frame is this leg. So the larger part, that's just riding in the frame, not doing anything, which means that when it comes to actually engaging, it's just going to pick up the trigger bar, or excuse me, pick up the sear, and bring it forward by hitting it there. So I was hoping we'd be able to see, based on like a wear mark or something, exactly where it does this. I'm pretty sure if we try and measure, and all things being equal, if the sear is there, the trigger bar is here, it's either going to be coming back on this surface here, and that's actually my better guess, is that it's actually going to grab that surface and bring it forward. And so it's not touching the top part of it, where that's actually the sear surface for the double action. And the reason that this comes out, we know the top part is the actual sear. this bottom plate is going to be where it actually gets engaged by the trigger bar. And so placing that, determines all the angles involved. And since your spring force is applied here, but your rotation point is there, that's really not adding any mechanical advantage. So you're pulling pretty straight on that spring, which means that spring really is determining the whole of the single action force. So, and that's it for the sear. So the sear has where it holds the spring. The top part here is the hammer drop for the safety. The shiny surface is the single action sear. This other beefy bit at the bottom is where it's engaged by the trigger bar in single action. And then in double action, all of it's done down here. And I'm guessing that, yes, in double action, there's one little puzzle that I'm not 100% sure of, which is the sear is going to bring it forward. I'm not sure what ends up pushing the sear out of the way. We'll have to see if we can catch that as we put it back together. So to put it back together, we're going to want to get that sear back in first. And I'm just going to try and line that up visually and get that pin started. And like the genius I am, I did not actually have the sear all the way in place when I did that. There we go. So now the sear is in place, but now we've got the challenging bit, which is the sear spring. And so there is a channel, which I don't know if you guys can see or not. There's a channel in here that it rides in, and the key is that the orientation is like this. No, it's like this, which we'll see put some pressure on it. So it says like that. If you flip it over, then I think that's backwards, and that's not going to actually work. Or is it? Let's see. Yeah, no, this is it. So that as the sear pushes back on that, that would tighten the coil of the spring. When springs are working, their coils are getting tighter. So that's one thing that you can use to help if you're having problems orienting a spring in your head. All right, so I've got this started there, and I'm going to run out of fingers. I'm going to lay that in its groove, and I'm going to come in from this side with my punch. And this is a small punch, smaller than the hole. And I'm going to use that punch to hook the spring and lower it. And hopefully I can get it down low enough that I can catch it with the pin. And apparently the answer is not today. So I'm going to reset that, slide the pin back over so it's not in the way. Again, I'm going to get this guy over there and far enough up that I can see him. Come in with my punch to hang on to him, and I think I might have gotten him that time. Haha. Yes, I did. So now that I've hooked him, I will center that little punch, and excuse me, that little piece, and we're gonna grab the sear and make sure it's doing its job. And I put it in upside down. Not the sear, but the spring. After all of that, after telling you the right way to do it, when I dropped it in there, I flipped it again. So, same technique, just hopefully doing it on the right side this time. Oh, for Pete's sake. I did the exact same thing. I don't know why my brain is having such a hard time with this. That's what's going on. Maybe I'm flipping it as I put it in there. I think I've got it one way and I've actually dropped it in the other. So maybe I'm wrong. Maybe in this case the coil is working backwards. Not be the first time I was wrong. Not be the first time I was wrong today. My concern is that that's really not got any sear spring pressure if it's that way. Until the sear is way the hell forward. I feel that that's just way wrong. So what I'm going to do to sanity check all of this is slide my hammer in real quick. And look at how that's engaging. And yeah, no, that spring is completely backwards. I was right the first time. It just looks funny. But that's alright. So my logic was correct the first time. What got me? Oh, that's what got me, is I had it in upside down. The long leg is the bottom, the short leg is the top. Sorry. Alright, so once again, using the punch to grab that and get it started. And then just centering. That's why it looks so funny. What I was doing is I would come around and manipulate the sear, and because I had the long leg on top, it would stick all the way out into the magazine well. And I'm like, that can't be right. If it intrudes into the magazine well, nothing's going to work. And of course, nothing would have worked. Now, if I recall, the hammer strut needs to go in now, because we're not going to be able to get it in later. And that will be one of the challenges, is that we will have to line up the hammer strut at the same time as we push that sear out of the way. So let's see, I think I might have enough room to get the hammer pin in first, and that means we can just wiggle, or even be smarter and just grab the hammer strut and center it that way. And it's going to flop around, so we'll get that set up later. Now this was what I wanted to see that I couldn't quite see before, so I'm going to put the trigger bar in even though it's not the right time for it, just to look and see how that single action mode works. So I'm just holding that spring out of the way, and I'm going to set this guy in there. Alright, so in single action, trying to see is exactly where I catch the spring. So the hammer, the disconnect spring will be pushing the trigger bar up, and I can basically see the trigger, and we know that that comes further across and is behind the sear. The real question is exactly where on the sear is that? So the answer to that question is, well, it's writing at the very top. So if we take our trigger, let's actually fire the gun here so that we can reset all the way. And take our trigger bar out. Again, relieve that spring tension. So cock it, and what we saw was we could see this piece riding right up against that, nice shiny on the frame, which means that in fact I was correct. The part of the sear that we see is that protruding ledge, and the trigger bar fits right in there and pulls it out of the way. And I believe in double action, what's happened here is that that same piece of the trigger bar is it's a ramp on the top side, and that ramp is being cammed out. So the hammer itself is going to cam the sear out of engagement. Now, if it goes back, too far, the sear can then pop in past all that and re-engage it. But what's going on here is that in double action, the trigger bar will be grabbing the underside of the hammer and bringing it forward. So as the trigger bar grabs here and brings it forward, it's also camming the sear out of the way. So by the time it drops, the sear will have been pushed off, and then the sear would just bounce back against the trigger bar, which would be at the same position anyway. And so that's your long double action. Is this is your both what pushes the sear completely out of the way and is itself the sear for single or for double action. And then in single action, when it's cocked, it simply is the engagement surface for the single action. Alrighty then. Let's put those guys back together. So let's see, the hammer drop just has to be on the right side of the sear. So you're just going to make sure it's tucked behind the sear on the inside. It's really not going to have a whole lot of ways it can go in wrong. And then the firing pin safety lever, you have to kind of bring it up from underneath because of the shape of the frame there. And then get some light in there to line up the hole. And you can almost push that one all the way through. And you really shouldn't need a hammer to get it to go in. It should just seat, and just seat it as deep as it goes. And the slide will hold that all in there. And test the hammer drop. So now in single action, it's retained until that gets pushed. Now there was the other mystery that I still haven't figured out, which was what part of that safety, when it's going to do the hammer drop, why would it have built all that extra technology to push the disconnector down? And I guess the answer is that I know the answer. Alright. For everything, there is a good reason. Smart people make guns. Alright, so I'm gonna basically manipulate this to put my trigger bar back in. Okay, so we established that if the trigger is up, it's going to pull the safety forward, or excuse me, the sear forward. So no matter how we slice it, when the trigger is pulled, the sear is forward, and we need to disconnect. So when it's going to do a hammer drop, I guess I still have the same mystery, which is I can't seem to come up with a scenario where the hammer is cocked, but the trigger bar is in some fashion, you know, in the way. In other words, if we just disconnect it, oh, hold the phone. Hold everything. No. So if we're disconnected and the hammer drops, it's still going to pull the sear back as the hammer comes, or pull the trigger bar back. If we're engaged when the hammer drops, alright, so right now the sear is holding the hammer back. We're going to be moving the sear out of position, which lets the hammer drop. If there was a round in it, I feel like... Alright, so let's try that again, only this time we'll simulate disconnecting first, and then the hammer drops. It still comes just as far forward. Alright, well, one of you geniuses out there in YouTube land, solve that mystery. Why, when the hammer drop is engaged, did they feel the need to force a disconnection? What am I missing? I admit that I'm missing something. They wouldn't have designed it that way without a reason. And I'm not sure what it is I'm missing. So, denizens of YouTube, flying monkeys, do your thing. Figure out what I can't. So I'm just putting the disconnect spring back in. And, you know, I said it was easier to take it out on the inside. I'm thinking getting it back together might be easier from the outside, because that hole is hard to reach otherwise. So get it in there, and boom. So now our disconnect has a return force. Excellent. Let's see what's left to take down. We can go ahead and put this guy back on. So this leg is going to go through the tiny hole and also retain our trigger pin, and then the other leg needs to get caught in that groove as we go back in. And I believe that this is easiest to do using the part itself to manipulate all of this, which may stretch it out just a little bit as we go back, but I'm going to get that in, And as I rotate around, I know that I'm putting a little more stress on that spring than I like, but it's pretty easy to get it back in there and have it do its thing. Now we need to reassemble our takedown mechanism. And we saw that our spring went in, and if we had this in, then in order to get this in, our flat surface needed to be towards the top. But you know what? Our spring is bound if we do it that way. So I'm going to take this out so that we don't bind up that spring, because that's bugging me. Yeah, that's better. And just go ahead and put this in. Set it back. We have to rotate this guy. Once he's rotated around the right amount, then he can engage the lock. Put it into the unlock position. And now we're going to make sure that our hammer strut is in place. That looks good. And as we discussed before, the side of the grip that's got the notch is going to be engaged by this pin sticking out like that, which means the ramp side is that side as well. So this is going to go through like that, which means that when we put it together, we want to I'm just seating this spring in there because it's easier to do the spring that way than get it once it's actually already on the hammer strut. So come on, there we go. So yeah, ramp side to there. Line that spring up. Squeeze that all the way down and slide that guy in. And if I have it the right way, then a gentle push on this side should have him pop over. I'm going to put him back in a centered mode so that we can get the grips back on. Now the grips, you got to be careful. These little leaves here do engage the top, and you have to spread it just a little bit as you're getting on to get those over past everything. So don't just try and squish it on. You don't want to break those guys off. So ever so slightly, widen it to get them started. And then once you're in here, there's actually room in that safety. That piece slides right under the magazine release. And the thing really does just cinch into place. And now that it's there, we're going to take our punch and do what we illustrated a second ago. Push gently until we hear the pop. And now we can see that pin has come out. Now we can't get those grips back off. Double action. No disconnect till we actually disconnect. Reset. Hammer drop works. Still not sure why the hammer drop has a built-in disconnect. Our disconnector spring a little weak. Not sure why. Oh, I guess it depends on where it is in the trigger pull. That's not really weak. It's definitely popping up vigorously. Okay. So, to put it back together, there's one thing about the way that this hooks in, which is the barrel. If you have the barrel up and you see it mate at the top, that's not really correct. There's a hood here, and the barrel actually belongs just underneath it. So if the barrel's up here, it's not really there. You can tell by the extractor as well. When it's lined up, it'll match the extractor. Okay. There we can see, the lugs moving and all that good stuff. And again, we want to make sure that that's lined up. So that's correct. So we can put in our recoil spring, small part forward. That's going to protrude out the end. There is a rounded recess there that slips into. It helps get it all good and centered. I like to do this with the hammer back. It's just easier once it gets to the right spot. And with all those things in place, the whole shebang will slide through. And as I put it all the way back, that piece is going to hit a point where it's going to pop itself right back up for you. And if it doesn't, then you just lock the slide back and then manipulate it by hand. But basically, the way that spring is pushing on it, it really wants to push it into that lock position. And so once it's back up, the button will pop out, hold it in place, slide release. That's why. All right, my mystery question was, why did this piece of the safety have that little extension to push down on the disconnector? And the answer is, it has nothing to do with the hammer drop. The hammer drop is solely that lever pushing down and dropping the hammer. But the reason that it does what it does to the disconnector is to disable the trigger. So when the safety is on, not only is there no firing pin button exposed, but the trigger does not cock the hammer anymore because the disconnector is permanently activated. So it wasn't about dropping the hammer, it was about permanently holding the trigger out of engagement. So it still comes up after it's too late to grab the hammer, and interestingly enough, it does still end up engaging the firing pin safety, but it never grabs the hammer to cock it back again. So now that disconnector is up, as soon as we move the trigger, we're moving the hammer. But now that pin is holding it down so that the disconnector doesn't get to do its thing. That's what it was. Every part has a purpose, and a purpose for every part. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the Beretta 92. Stay safe. 92.